Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session. In this session, we are going to host Professor David Lambert, and webinar is about publishing in high-quality journals. First of all, I want to introduce Professor Lambert, of course, in brief, and then he can introduce himself more and talk about his expertise. Professor David Lambert is biologist, pharmacologist, and professor of anesthetic pharmacology in Leicester, UK. He is past director, grants officer, administration director of the BJA, board chair, and inaugural grants officer, National Institute for the Academic Anesthesia. Past editor of Anesthesia, Intensive Care Medicine, Pharmacology section. He has received major awards. For example, Humphrey Davy Medal from the Royal College of Anesthesists, elected to an eponymous professorship to Royal College of Anesthesists, FRCA by election first of two non-clinicians to be elected, Association of Anesthetists Foundation Award, Mapleson Medal, Anesthetic Research Society, elected fellow British Pharmacological Society. And he was a visiting professor to the University of Hirosaki in Japan, to the University of Kyushu in Japan, to the University of Kufa in Iraq, and honorary professor of Hubei University of Medicine in China. David, welcome to this session, and we're all ready to hear your great speech on publishing in high quality journals. Yes, please.
Thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to talk today about publishing in general, but it will be very, I guess, flavored towards my own experience, which is with the British Journal of Anaesthesia. So it will necessarily cover a lot of the things that the BJA will require for submissions of manuscripts and the sort of things that we look at when we judge whether a manuscript is suitable for publication, but they're relevant across the whole spectrum. So my objectives for today is really to give you a little bit of insight into the kind of operational stuff in preparing a manuscript that would be suitable for publication, and to give you a little bit of a feel about what editors will think when they look at the manuscript, and to perhaps point out a few pitfalls that you might come across in terms of often getting the manuscript beyond the first stage of just triage, because a lot of journals now don't even send manuscripts out for peer review when they feel that it's unlikely to reach the bar for publication. So there are a few little tricks and tips that we can discuss to get you beyond that. And I'd also like to spend a few moments talking about issues relating to ethics, animal use, and conflicts of interest, because I think these are particularly vexatious issues that a lot of journals are becoming very, very hot on at the moment. And I think if you look at things like Retraction Watch, you'll see that a lot of material seems to be making it through to press, and then subsequently is proven to be a little bit less than honest, and in the end ends up being retracted. And I think having something retracted is probably much worse than having something rejected in the first place. So what about me? Shola's given a little bit of a summary of my kind of, sort of narrative credentials, but why am I here today talking to you about publication? What right do I have to do that? What's my experience? So I'm currently an active researcher. I've been researching since I had my PhD in 1987, and I've been an active researcher, fully funded for all of that period of time. I work predominantly on opioids. I'm not clinical. I work in the laboratory, but I'm involved in clinical research, and I've been in a clinical department. So I have several clinical manuscripts, some clinical studies, some retrospective analyses of patient samples as well. So I've got quite a broad experience as a researcher. I've been heavily involved with the British Journal of Anaesthesia for probably a quarter of a century now, and was the laboratory sciences editor for 12 years. I currently chair the board, so I have a lot of experience in deciding what sort of manuscripts we might want to take, what kind of manuscripts we don't, and a lot of practical experience of where things would fail. In terms of the title, which was about high quality journals, so the British Journal of Anaesthesia is currently rated second in category. It's either been 1, 2 or 3 for as many years as I can remember, and our current impact factor is almost 12. So I think we're up there with some of the very, very high quality journals. I have edited educational type material for anaesthesia and intensive care, so as well as looking at bona fide standard research manuscripts, I've also got some evidence in handling reviews and educational material. I think my H-index speaks for itself, so you know, I've been around the block a bit, and I do have quite a bit of practical experience, which I'm more than happy to share with you. So what I'd like to cover today is I'd like to break the talk down, I guess, into 4 main pieces. A little bit about the basics, about getting started, some advice on writing. Then we'll go through what a typical paper would look like and how that would look for the BJA, and perhaps think about how it might look for other journals. I'll spend a few moments talking about a Reeve guidance for use of animals. And then we'll have a bit of a summary, and then I'm sure there'll be some time at the end for us to have a little bit of a Q&A. Okay, so let's go. So this is my first and most important do in the do's and don'ts of how to get your paper published. The most important is when you've decided what journal you think you want to submit to that stands the best chance of getting your paper published, for goodness sake, get the instructions to authors and have a good look at them. It's really important that you follow the guidance, otherwise triage will flip your manuscript straight at the first stage and it'll come straight back to you. So typically, this is for the BJA, we have a number of different categories of manuscripts that we'll take. So clinical investigations, laboratory investigations, I guess the bread and butter, the standard sort of papers that we would accept. About 3,000 words. What's that? 3,000 words, 300 words per page, about 10 pages, something like that, 30 to 40 references, and then always be mindful of the number of display items that you can use. And when I'm starting to construct a paper, I always begin with my results and my display items, so I kind of fit that in. So if the BJ only takes 4 to 6 and I've got 14 display items, then perhaps the BJ may not be the right place for it, or we might need to think to repackage the material. We also cover review articles, as you might expect, substantially longer, and we take editorials. Editorials are typically invited. They're on very topical issues, or they relate to some papers that are previously published in the journal. And very occasionally, we publish case reports. Case reports tend not to be cited very well. They're very good educationally, but in terms of improving the impact factor of the journal, they don't really make a big impact. So it has to be a pretty amazing major case report for it to make it into press. However, there are journals, case report journals in particular, that will take just case reports. So if that's your starting point, then you know that's the kind of journal that you should be looking for. So first and most important do is make sure you get the instructions to authors and follow them. They're there for a reason. This is something else that a lot of journals are now doing, that the vast majority of mainstream journals now are predominantly online. British Journal of Anaesthesia is predominantly online now. So there is a supplement which you can add additional materials that might help explain a point, some extra methodology, a little bit of data that's kind of negative maybe, but is nevertheless important. That can improve the reach of your paper and the volume that you can publish. So think very carefully about an online supplement. If you need to use it, then use it. And there's a little bit of a game often that's played that If you put too much material in the manuscript to begin with, you can always agree during the revision process to move it into an online supplement. So there's a little bit of a game to play. Okay, we've selected some thoughts about a journal. Where do you actually start? How does it all begin? So obviously your starting point is a good idea, and I think there's an axiom that says that good quality, strong research will always find its way into press, and good quality, strong research, you can almost choose where that's going to be published. You know, ideally you'd want to send it to Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, Cell, those kind of journals. And if it's really tippy top good quality science, then you'll stand a good chance as long as you follow the rules. There's then this kind of important class of research that kind of sits somewhere in the middle, that's not general but is more specific, and it goes to journals like the British Journal of Anaesthesia, or I don't know, British Journal of Surgery, International Journal of you know, Spiritual Medicine, those sort of things. But if it's a good idea and it's well presented, the likelihood is you'll get it published. So when you start, there's this finer little idiom that we use. So thinking about the question, is the question feasible? So can you do it? So it's no good embarking on a study that you need to recruit 50,000 patients prospectively, and you're a tiny little hospital in the middle of nowhere. Is it feasible? Maybe not. Is it interesting? So that's the sort of thing that's going to pique the interest of the readers. It's also going to pique the interest of the peer reviewers and the editor to make sure that it gets out to peer review. And I guess the way you write it and the way it's presented in the first instance will help to increase the interest question. Is it novel? That's often one of the big reasons why papers get rejected. It's sent for peer review and somebody says, I read this 2 years ago, it was done by researcher XYZ in country ABC. So if it's not novel, it's unlikely to get it published in a high quality journal. However, there is sometimes a strong case to be made for confirmatory research. So if something that's been published in New England Journal, for example, really high quality, a bit controversial, there's sometimes a place for some of that to be repeated and effectively be verified. It would be unlikely that any JM would take it, but it might be something that some of the specialist journals would take. Make sure that what you're doing is ethical, and make sure that it's relevant. It's relevant specific to the journal. So if you're going to put in a predominantly clinical journal, it needs to be relevant for those readerships. Always try to articulate the question in the form of a hypothesis, and typically that's the last bit of your introduction. Often it's not clear what the authors are trying to do and why in fact they're doing it, and if they'd formulated that into a reasonably easy hypothesis that can then be tested and can give a kind of answer. You don't have to prove the hypothesis at the end of it. In fact, your results and your final conclusion could be the hypothesis was wrong, and it sets up a whole different series of ideas. So articulate in the form of a hypothesis. And what I would then do is, after the hypothesis, I would kind of flesh that out a little bit with a few aims and objectives, and that would probably relate to the methodology that you're going to use. And then for clinical studies, this is often already set for you, because your ethics committee approval will have what you're allowed to do. So use that. You've already written it. You've already had it peer reviewed. It would be nuts not to use it in anger. So make sure you use that appropriately. It actually defines what you're allowed to do. Okay, let's go down the slide. Okay, thinking about journals. So I've kind of brushed over that quite quickly, I guess. It's often quite difficult to decide on a journal. For me, as a pharmacologist, it's pretty straightforward. I work on opiates. I either publish in the British Journal of Pharmacology, If it's clinically relevant, I publish in the British Journal of Anaesthesia. And if I think it's really great, I have a go with Nature, New England, whatever. I've managed to get one paper into Nature in a 30-year career, so it doesn't happen very often. So thinking of your own specialty, you probably think of where the top journals are in your own specialty. Those are probably where you want to start. You need to make sure that the material is relevant to the journal that you're submitting it. It's no point in submitting some hardcore biochemistry to a dermatology journal or vice versa. So just bear that in mind. The other thing that's often important institutionally, perhaps less so for individuals, because you just want to get your work published in the best journal possible, but institutionally, impact factor is quite important. So in my own institution, I'm expected to try to publish in the top 10% of journals in field in terms of impact factor. So top 10% is where we would ideally go. And I'm sure some of you have same institutional requirements. The other thing I look for is if I'm doing something that's quite topical, it's quite new, and I want to get the data out, I'd look at turnaround time. So British Journal of Anaesthesia typically has a very, very rapid turnaround time to first decision. Often, if it's not good, then the triage flips that manuscript out very, very quickly. So have a bit of a think about turnaround time. Again, guide to contributors, make sure you look at the guide to contributors. And the other issue, let's just get this out there now, English. So if English isn't your first language, that should not be a disbar for you submitting a manuscript to an English journal. But there are things that you can do to help yourself. If a peer reviewer reads a manuscript and the English is so poor that they can't understand what you've done, then the likelihood is it'll be rejected, and it'll be rejected on English. But there are ways around that. You can get English help. Sometimes some of the journals, my own journal in particular, can offer advice and can point in non-English authors in the right direction in terms of getting the English checked, help with construction, and there are places you can buy that kind of service. My own advice would be try to find a friendly native English speaker. It doesn't have to be English, it could be American English, it could be Canadian English, it could be whatever style is appropriate. Just to be sure that what you're submitting can be read and can be understood. So English isn't a disbar, it's just a problem if the reviewers can't read it. So give that some serious thought. Okay, let's think a little bit about conflicts of interest. So this is often a bit of a vexatious issue that we see in the journal, and authors and authorship. So there are often conflicts between authors, potential conflicts with peer reviewers. Most journals will allow you to suggest some names that you would not like your paper reviewed by, and I would take that very, very seriously. That, if you're working on drug X, mechanism X, and another researcher thinks what you're doing is totally wrong, and you've had some correspondence over the years, then you clearly explain that to the journal, and the journal will then take that into consideration. Whole hosts of potential conflicts, but I think the most important point is do declare your conflicts. If there are conflicts that are discovered afterwards, most high quality journals will simply pull your manuscript from the peer review process and it will be rejected. Authorship. Let's think for a second about authorship. We hate this. Culturally, I can see sometimes how that might be seen as something good to do, that, often the head of department who's had zero interest, zero input, not read, produced no funding, is gifted onto a manuscript. That's not acceptable. There are serious criteria for determining who is an author on a manuscript, and those people need to have made substantial contributions. They should have been involved in drafting the paper. They all should have approved it, and this is the most important. They all need to be accountable for that manuscript. So if a manuscript's found subsequently to be fraudulent, then the entire authorship is fraudulent because you agree to be accountable for that. And there are some pretty high profile cases over the years of manuscripts that have been pulled, medics who've been struck off their appropriate medical registers, sanctioned by their institutions, and effectively their careers ended. So, you know, think very long and hard about this. It takes a lifetime to build a career, and a few moments of madness can end it very quickly. So take that very seriously. Okay, thinking about writing. So some of the do's of writing. I would always say, just get to the point. Be direct. Say what you mean. Don't go round and round trying to waffle into something that could be said very, very simply. Typically, the introduction to a manuscript should be short. It should summarize the state of play. It should summarize why you're doing something, what you're doing. Get to the point. Keep it simple. Keep the writing simple. There's no value in producing a very complex literary masterpiece that would work as would sit in the library as a book. We're scientists, we're clinicians, we're researchers. We want to know what you've done, and we want you to get to the point. So keep it simple. In your writing, always try to be precise, and that's particularly important in methodology. So when people are trying to replicate what you've done, they'll understand what you've done because you'll have written it in a precise way. And you know, if you've used a particular scoring scale for pain, be precise on what it is, how you've used it, how you've analysed it, just so people can understand what you've done and copy it. Try not to fill a manuscript up with jargon. They're incredibly difficult to read. They get very dull and people lose interest in it. If you do have to use jargon, then explain it. And if the explanation needs to be long, then put it in the online supplement. That's perfectly sensible use of things. If you've got a particular technique that really you just need to say, this is what the technique is, and people will accept it. But if somebody wants to read about it and know a little bit more, obviously there's the referencing, but you could also explain it in the online supplement. Okay, let's go through some of the bits and pieces of the manuscript as written. So title is super important. And I'd ask you the question, how many papers have you been on PubMed and you've saw a paper, you've looked at the title and you think, wow, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And then you open it up and it's something completely different. I think you owe it to your readership and you owe it to yourself to make sure that the manuscript title says what's actually in there. We have a saying in the UK, you know, it does exactly what it says on the tin. So absolutely clear. Include, if it's animal work, include species. If it's in vitro work, include the model that you're using. If it's clinical, include the patient group that you're using, the particular type of disease, so that it's quite clear when you pull it that it, you know, this is exactly what it is. And I give a pharmacological example as a pharmacologist. So drug X binds to receptor Y and it has different affinities in central and peripheral tissues. So the kind of the title that would make people pull the paper and then be disappointed would be, wow, you've got different drug affinities, you must have 2 types of receptors. Wow, that's kind of misrepresenting what's in there. And the more sensible one of you know, describing what was happening, comparative effects of blah blah blah, that's probably more appropriate. So be sensible about how you set the title, and remember that when people use PubMed, that's what's going to come out. The title, bits that are in the abstract, and the keywords is what will get people to your paper. And when they get to your paper, then they're more likely to cite it. That's likely to improve its impact factor. It's likely to improve your H index. And it's just possible you might end up with a whole new series of collaborators who think what you're doing is good and they'd like to work with you. Okay, the abstract. I always write the abstract last. When I've completely finished writing everything else, the last thing I would do is write the abstract. Remember, the abstract is basically a mini version of your paper. Sometimes, for some journals, it's structured, and the one in the top corner is an example. And you know, it's a truism which I think is a bit sad, is it's often the only part of a paper that anybody ever reads, for a variety of reasons. We're too busy, we can't be bothered to pull the full paper, we don't subscribe, so we can't see it, so we end up just looking at the abstract. So I would say, as an editor looking at abstracts, the kind of things that I would consider as a good abstract will be something that contains some data. So it's clear what you've done, it's clear why you've done it, it's got your key data, and it's got a few other bits and pieces in it. So in this example, the clinical trials registration is listed. So if I don't pull the paper, I can just cut out that clinical trials number, I can put it into the internet, and then I can determine what exactly has been allowed in your ethics approval. Okay, intro. Intro is usually too long. And bearing in mind that a lot of people where English is not their main language struggle to write it, why would you do that? Why would you set yourself up to write a huge piece of work that you're going to struggle with when often a lot of it's not necessary? The introduction just simply sets the scene. If you're writing a review, that's totally different. That's providing logical, reasoned arguments and then pulling narrative and data. That's totally different. So for a standard, ordinary manuscript, your intro should set the scene, and it doesn't need to be too long. A couple of 100 words is perfectly fine. Describe the background. What's known, what's unknown, what are the uncertainties? If it's for a clinical study, you know, what are the treatment uncertainties? Why on earth are you doing it? And why should I read it? Make sure before you even get to the start of the study that you've done a proper literature search, because the worst thing in the world is to spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of effort putting in a manuscript that the reviewers say, I read this 2 years ago, it's old stuff, reject. So, you know, even when you're planning your study, get your literature searches done and be sure what you're doing is new and important. Hypothesis, make sure the hypothesis is covered. I've talked about that a little bit earlier on. Final paragraph should state clearly what your primary and what your secondary aims or primary and secondary outcomes, the kind of measures that you're going to make. Make sure it's clear, so that, you know, when you get to the end of the intro, you'll know I'm doing this because this is where it fits into the literature, this is what the treatment uncertainty is, and this is what my hypothesis is. And sometimes it's okay to give a little bit of a taster of the results section. So you can say we have shown that. And as I've written in the bottom, 200 words, about 1.5 pages, double spaced, is about right for an intro. Don't set yourself to write something that you struggle with when you don't really need to. Materials and methods. For me, as an experimentalist, this is the bit that I usually read first. If I can't believe your materials and methods, if I can't believe how you've done something, then I'm absolutely not going to believe the results that you're going to present to me. So it's important. Some manuscripts, some journals keep the materials and methods right until the end, but it's always there, often in smaller font, often with a larger allowable volume. Make sure you follow the rules. Again, look at the instructions for authors. So your methods should give a clear, but again, to the point, description of the process of the study. Use some flowcharts if necessary, and we'll talk about consort diagrams in a minute. Sort of things that you should cover: ethics approval, patient populations, your criteria, why did you include people, why did you exclude people, how did you do it, a little bit on data handling, and then, of course, the bit that everybody hates and has trouble with often is statistics. For a clinical study, particularly, make sure you've got power calculation. If there's no power calculation, you don't know what the population is going to be, then it's a pilot study, I think, probably by definition. Don't be afraid to go and take advice. I'm not a statistician. I know what statistics I know, and I also know what statistics I don't know, and I go and take advice for that. So don't be afraid to take advice, and acknowledge that in the manuscript you took statistical advice from, and you know, give them the credit for the help that they've given you. If that is substantial and it makes a difference to the manuscript, then there's a possibility that maybe they should be considered as authors. Okay, let's think a little bit about ethics. This is another kind of vexatious issue that we're seeing a lot, that it's not often not made absolutely crystal clear that ethics approval has been granted, has been waived, is not required. It needs to be made perfectly crystal clear in your manuscript. Everything follows, obviously, the Declaration of Helsinki. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and you can follow this link. Anything doesn't meet the Declaration of Helsinki, it just won't go to peer review. It'll be rejected immediately. So bear that in mind. If anything gets published, and sometimes this does happen, and you find that the authors have been a bit economical with truth and it's not compliant, it will be withdrawn, retracted, and the individual's employers, as per guidance for the IJCME, would then be made aware that this is what academics in their institution are doing. Make sure it goes in the first paragraph of your methodology that you've approved ethics. Put the name of the committee, any details that you got, put that in. And that's fine. And then reviewers can then check that if they want. It's often a reason, as I've said, for a manuscript to be returned. You should state written informed consent was obtained from all subjects, a legal surrogate, parents, legal guardians for a minor, or that informed consent is waived by the ethics committee, whichever is appropriate. You need to make sure that that's pretty clear. I think it's quite obvious that human subjects should not be identifiable. So if you're going to put some pictures in, you need to get approval for the pictures, and they should be blinded so that it's not clear who that particular individual is. And clinical trials should have some form of authorization. There's an example of UDRACT, clinicaltrials.gov. There are a few other examples across the world, and they will be checked by the peer reviewers, and often they'll be checked at submission by the editorial office staff. So again, as a do make sure that your ethics are compliant, well described, and we can find, for clinical studies, we can find where your clinical trials have been registered. So how should you report the conduct of a clinical trial? You could just start writing, start a narrative, and off you go. It could get very long, could get very tortuous, so bits and pieces that you may forget. But there is this Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials, which we now use. Certainly the BJA requires, this is a requirement now for submission, that you've used consort guidance and you produce a consort diagram. Effectively, it's a flow chart which describes the conduct of the study, where you've recruited, where things have dropped out, and there are a series of categories and a checklist, and you can find it at this website here. And in the next slide, this is a blank consort diagram that you can download from that website and then customize for your own particular manuscript. And there's instructions and information on the categories of information that you need to put into this particular diagram. And then, I guess in its simplest form, writing about the conduct of the study is, once you've written the consort diagram, you write a narrative starting at the top and ending at the bottom, and it then becomes pretty simple and pretty straightforward. So it covers enrollment, allocation, follow-up, and analysis in a fairly simplistic way. And of course, when you're randomizing into two groups, you can then flip the consort into the two kind of strains. So it's probably better covered with the real example. So these are a couple of examples from some of my own work. So this is from an observational study where we just we took some patients who were on cardiopulmonary bypass. We took 53 patients. We excluded for a variety of reasons, and the final study analysed 40 patients. We also used 2 groups of ICU patients with matched volunteers. So we've got our ICU patients and we've got our matched volunteers. And it just makes it really simple. We know how many patients we recruited. We know where they were because we've got a spreadsheet with it, and we just populated the consort diagram. And then the paper, the narrative, was incredibly easy to write. Just start at the top, work your way down to the bottom. Very logical, very direct, very simple, and you got to the point. So I think it's important to think about this and use this to your benefit. Okay, what about animals? Animal use. Again, another vexatious issue, and often a reason why papers are rejected. What a lot of people don't realise is that in the Declaration of Helsinki, which we all imagine is for humans, the Declaration of Helsinki actually quotes welfare of animals for research must also be respected, and we all tend to follow this kind of declaration here, and some of the individual, institutional, and in-country rules are followed. So studies involving animals, you must state that you've got institutional approval, state where that approval was from. So if you're from the University of X, animal approval committee from the Institute of X agreed approval, and the approval number was such and such, and possibly the date in which it was approved, and then you're covered. In the UK, we tend to put in a Home Office license number and some local material, and the majority of manuscripts that I would say from the UK and from the US and from the majority of the major European states would use their local rules and regulations as their baseline. So BJA would use UK standards as their baseline, and you should find out what they are. And there's an interesting little guide here, Guide to Use of Laboratory Animals, which you might find some extra information. We often include too many animals in an experiment, and that's because we haven't done a proper a priori power calculation, and excessive use of animals, excessive and unwarranted use of animals, is often a reason that paper can be rejected. And there are lots of in-country organisations in my own country, NC3Rs, which is about replacement, refinement and reduction of use of animals. In fact, if you submit a manuscript to British Journal of Pharmacology, for example, there are some very, very strict guidance on the numbers of animals, how you calculate the numbers of animals, and having group parity, so that they're the same numbers per group. So it's important that you take this into account and that you're careful with it. So, so just like the consort for the reporting of clinical studies, there is an equivalent for the reporting of animal studies, and these are called ARIV guidelines. And the major journals now will expect you to follow ARIV guidelines. So these are certainly followed by some of the biggies. The British Journal of Anaesthesia also now requires this, and some of our major funders across most of UK, US, and most of continental Europe would require you to follow ARIV guidelines. So what are they, and how can they help? So again, just like consort, there are a series of categories. Titles, abstract, intro, materials and methods, results and discussion, with a variety of numbered headings. You don't have to follow, and you don't have to have answers for every particular heading. But if you structure an animal in vivo experimental manuscript around the ARIV guidelines, it will, number one, make it easier for you to write. And number two, it will allow you to say in your submission letter that the manuscript followed ARIV guidance, which then raises it a category, and people say this is top quality, well conducted research. I don't propose going through this in any particular detail, but there is a website that you can go and pull all this material down, and it will help you to structure the writing process. So another do make sure that when you're doing in vivo animal work, that you follow the rules, that you're ethical in how you do it, and use the ARIV guidance to help you write the manuscript. It'll just make your life so much easier. Okay, what about results? So this section, a little bit of guidance. Your results must be factual. Get to the point and don't over-interpret what's in there. Just say what you've got. The reader can then make their mind up about what they think, and the discussion section will allow you to kind of get across what you think about it. They must be factual, they must relate to the aims, so there's no point in throwing in some different series of data for which there's no methodology and you've not explained why you're doing it. That's a recipe for a disaster. It will show poor construction, poor writing, and it's likely to get paper rejected. Trying to put your results into a logical order and trying to make story out of it, because at the end of the day, you've done the research, you know what it's about, and you know why you did it. So the reader's seeing this fresh, and to have a kind of story told that makes it easy to read, again, be precise, get to the point, but put it in a nice logical order. So we did experiment 1, we did clinical study 1, and the results showed that. So in response to this, we then did, and then it all follows a nice logical sequence, and it reads well, and it makes it so much easier to review. State your significances. Coming back to your statistics, be very clear. So there was a statistical difference between X and Y, p-value was, test was, and be honest in terms of statistical significance and clinical significance. So the heart rate changed from 60 to 62, p less than 0.0000001, because you had 6,000 patients in each group. Clearly statistically significant, but clinically of no significance whatsoever. Negative findings. This is this is another vexatious issue, that fully negative manuscripts often get rejected and triaged out. They do for the big journals, but for some of the specialist journals, that's not the case. Not anymore. And if you go for journals like some of the open access, like PLOS, PLOS One, negative findings are important. They're very important when you're setting up a study. It's important to read something that says effectively, don't do this because the results are negative and it doesn't work. If we don't publish this, then we'll all end up doing studies, some of which were never going to work because they've already been tried and they don't. So negative findings are important. Do include them in your paper, and negative manuscripts will get published somewhere. So don't be too shy about that. Results, again, come back to your consort, make sure that your numbers add up. The number of papers that I've reviewed over the years that says, we recruited 30 patients to each group, and then you look at the data and there's and 22 and 21 comes to 43. You think, where the hell have the rest gone? And they've not explained, the numbers don't add up, and then that's just an instant rejection. So be careful about how you write it. If you've got your consort diagram done, then you shouldn't really have any problems. Okay, display items. Like I said at the top of the show, I tend to do this first. I decide what I'm going to show, and I usually get together with my co-authors and we have all the bits and pieces of data on the floor, and then we kind of think, what do we think this means? How does it fit with our aims? How does it fit with our original ethics approval? What's our story? What's our tack? We did the experiments in a particular order, but should we present them in the same order, or should we present them in a different order to make a coherent story? So make sure tables have titles and legends, that you've got units, stats, markings, abbreviations. You should be able to look at a table and understand it and not have to go back to the methodology. Same thing for figures. Legends, titles, units, highest quality available. They should be completely intelligible without having to go back to the methodology. Okay, a few other points as a kind of wrap up, I guess. So images and image manipulation. This is again becoming a bit of a problem. It's very easy to take a picture, and it's very easy to make that picture look like something that it wasn't. And it's very important not to do it, because if you do it and you get found out, it will be reported, and you will get into a whole series of issues with this. If you need to touch up a picture, then you should say so. It's not unreasonable to touch up a picture as long as it's perfectly clear what's been done. What's not acceptable is to touch up a picture where you have two groups and to touch up one of the groups and not the other. That's then image manipulation. It's fraudulent, and it could change the way that your paper is seen. And I have seen this done before, and it's been obvious because of the quality of the images. One looked much crisper than the other, and it was pretty obvious. If you have to do that, then you must state what you've done, and you must do the same to all groups. So I do some some confocal microscopy, and typically we do a little bit of image tweaking to make the images look more clear. So I describe in the paper what the settings were on the microscope and what the image collection rate was and how they were actually collected, and state quite clearly that these settings were consistent throughout the entire study. And I guess we've had lots of do's. This is don't. Whatever you do, don't do it. Don't manipulate images unless you're explicit about what you've done. Okay, discussion. This is the bit where people waffle and go on, and it gets very, very dull often. Get to the point, say what you mean. And there are a few simple algorithms that can help you with the writing. So a kind of long one would be recapitulate your findings, but not in the same detail as in the results. How do they fit with the literature? What's different? What you add to the subject, what your weaknesses are, what your future studies are, and what your conclusions are. Future studies is a funny one because some people are a bit guarded about their own research, that if you give too many future studies away, then somebody might do them, and they might have more money than you, and they can do it more quickly than you. So future studies, the kind that I would give is the ones that I've kind of already started or already finishing. Shorter version would be just summarize what you found, put it into context with the literature, and what does it all mean. But if you give yourself a writing algorithm and you put a few headings in there, then just populate that, and it might be in the wrong place. You can then shift it around. So pick off little bits of writing a little bit at a time. Make sure you acknowledge the help that other people have given you. If it's not enough to warrant authorship, then an acknowledgement is perfectly fine. People who are helping, clinical investigators, participating in investigations, etc. And referencing. The references, I think in probably 90% of papers that I was reviewing, there was always some issues with the references. They can be sorted, but if you've got a manuscript that's kind of borderline and a reviewer's looking at it, and they might think, well, the references, they're not right, they're not in the right order, they're careless, they'll think the rest of it's careless, and it might tip them towards offering a maybe reject decision. I'd be disappointed if a paper was rejected just on references, but if it's part of a bigger picture of careless preparation, then it might make a difference. So read the instructions. I'm sure everybody uses things like EndNote these days. You just import the right the right style, and it does it all for you. Okay, plagiarism, big issue. It's something that is taken incredibly seriously, and plagiarism ends careers. Make no mistake. The majority of journals will run submissions through a plagiarism detector. So we use Crossref. There's a variety of other things. And there are degrees of plagiarism. I'm sure in your own institution, you teach your own students, this is what plagiarism is. Make sure you're aware of it too. In the most extreme example, stealing data, making up data, stealing people's data, it does happen, it's quite rare. Less rare is lifting full sections from papers, but I have seen it. What seems to be slightly more common, and often in non-native English speakers, is taking a sentence from here and a sentence from there, and then stitching them together, thinking, well, I haven't taken very much from a particular paper, so it's not really plagiarism. But the fact is that en masse, you've taken quite a substantial piece of work from various bits of the literature, and that is plagiarism. It will be detected and it will get your paper rejected. Taking figures without attribution, that's breach of copyright. It's okay to take figures as long as you've gone to the copyright owner and say, can I reuse your figures? You'll normally be asked to sign the copyright declaration, and then they'll give you the right to use that material. If you do it without, breach of copyright, that'll get you into a whole lot of trouble too. So I think that's about 50 minutes or so. So I guess this has been my summary. Do have a clear hypothesis. Do have a reason for doing the work. Don't just go and repeat the work of others. Might be easy to do, but the likelihood is you probably won't get it published. Do make a case for it being important, and make sure you've done your homework. That is a very, very good literature search. Do be precise in your writing. Keep it simple. Get to the point. If English is not a native language, and if you're not a statistician, get advice and get help. There are people out there who would be more than happy to help you, and it will make a difference. And then in red, the guide to contributors. And I guess my final don't is, don't be tempted to cut corners, especially with conflict of interest, plagiarism, ethics, animal use. So I think on that point, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you very much. So I don't know how this works.
Thank you. Thank you, David. It was a very wonderful presentation, and our audience is very happy with what they heard from you. Several of our participants have asked for your recording, the recording of the session and your PowerPoints. Is it possible to share your slides and the recording with them? Is that fine with you?
I was under the impression that the recording was recorded and it was free for everybody to use forever, effectively. So absolutely not a problem.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to ask, we have Dr. Fatima Jawad with us. She is Editor-in-Chief, Journal of Pakistan Medical Association. I want to invite her to have a few words if she wants to. Dr. Fatima Jawad, do you want to share any ideas with us? Okay, till she has access to the system. Is there any question? Could you please raise your hand? Yeah, Dr. Muhammad Asaf. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a question about most of the high impact journals. They have acceptance rate about ranging from 4 to 10%. Yeah. It is my observation that if one high impact factor journal it reject the paper, if one send to the other, they accept it. What is the reason? Is there any reason of perceptions, or what are the other reasons for that?
Okay, that's a really important question and a very astute observation, and it's something that in my own career, I think I have about 3, 4, maybe I've stopped counting now, several hundreds of manuscripts. And I think the number that went into the first journal that I submitted is probably 10%, maybe. And I kind of, when I was talking about choose your journal wisely, so I would have a hierarchy of journals where I would want to send them to, and I always start with the general journal because they have the highest impact factor. But as you've said, rejection rate is probably 19 out of 20 are probably rejected, but they're often worth a go. And if what you're doing is quite novel and you think nobody else is doing it, then there's no loss in having a go at 1 or 2 of the high impact journals. So for me, I'll maybe start with Nature and then go to something that's at the kind of the top end of the middle journals would be where I would go next. Now, your question asked about what, is there any logic why one journal accepts and one journal doesn't. I don't really think there is any logic. I think it probably relates to the journal's perception of the field. So if you give an extreme example, I guess, you know, one of the nature stable journals, they would want the absolute best of the best. And their perception of that may be very different to somebody in, say, GIF, for example, who want the very best of the very best. And I think the kind of generalist looking at something that's very generalist is a bit different. Somebody, a specialist who's looking at something that's very high impact specialist. So I think if we had the answer to that, you know, a real solid answer to that, we would probably all be getting our papers into New England Journal or something like that. But you know, practically, if you've got a hierarchy of journals and it doesn't matter if your research waits a couple of months to get published, then I would always start with a high impact journal, with the next journal ready to go, which is a more specialist journal, and see what happens. I mean, I've submitted manuscripts to 4 journals often, and end up published in the 4th journal. And it's quite interesting that some of the stuff that I've published in what would be considered low impact factor journals are the ones that are the most highly cited. So you know, we need impact factors for our careers, but sometimes that's not really how science works. I hope that's answered. Well, I don't think it's answered your question. I think it's addressed the concern that you have.
So surely it's Dr. Shavi Zaidi. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Okay. Professor Lambert, I was preparing a lecture a couple of weeks ago about research ethics for one of the seminars, one of the courses. And in that I mentioned, of course, Declaration of Helsinki, but I also mentioned Belmont's principle. You've not mentioned that in your talk. Is there any importance? Is there any reason that it's not mentioned?
I've got, I had 45 minutes to cover it.
Oh, yeah.
And I think,
Right.
in you know, looking at this as an ex-journal editor, what I want to see is I want to see an ethics approval number somewhere. That's really what I want to see. And I'll make an assumption that if you've got an ethics approval number, and typically if for a clinical trial, if you've also got, for example, a UDRAC number or a clinicaltrials.gov number, I would probably click that and have a look at that. And that would reassure me as an editor that the study is ethical, it's been approved, it's been peer reviewed, and then I'm comfortable with it. So I mean, we could have taken the talk in several directions, but that was what I really wanted to get across. Was what's important is to make sure that you can state clearly that you do have approval, where you've got the approval from, and also that you've got all the web addresses. I mean, in the BJA, I can tell you categorically that the editorial staff will click every single clinical trials registry number to make sure that it's right. And if it says you're allowed to recruit, you know, 1,000 patients per group, and you've recruited 2,000 patients per group, there's something wrong there somewhere. So I didn't answer. I think I've answered your question. I didn't cover it because it didn't seem appropriate at the time for the amount of time that I had available.
No, thank you so much. One more question. How many do you have to submit your article to one journal at a time, or can you submit to several journals? Because many times the waiting time is so much that by the time it's published, it's either outdated or redundant or whatever. So what is the general principle?
Very important point, very important question. Dual submission for the vast majority of journals, I can't think of any that don't, is not allowed. So you can't have it submitted to 2 journals at the same time. My advice would be, if your research is very time sensitive, is to go for journals that have a very rapid turnaround time. That can work in your favour and against you, because often very rapid turnaround time often means that the manuscripts get triaged very quickly at the submission stage. And if they don't like the title because you're not being clever, then it just goes back. And I think the drive now for journals to be predominantly online has speeded up the process. So when I started with the BJA, we used to send everything out to peer review by post. And if somebody declined, they'd send it back by post. And then we'd have to find somebody else and we'd send it out by post. So things are a lot quicker now. But BJA, 14 days first time to first decision, something like that. So, you know, choose your journal. If the stuff can wait, then go for a higher impact journal and wait. So I think there's several questions you need to ask yourself as a researcher as to what you want the outcome to be. But you're right. Submission to 4 or 5 journals, 3-4 weeks per go could add a substantial amount of time to that. And I don't think there's a right answer, and I don't think there's any way you can preempt how that would go, other than the very first comment that I made is that you know, good quality important research will be published. So if your paper's high quality, it's well written and it means something, then you shouldn't worry about this because it'll get published anyway. We all know there's a little bit of a toss of a coin really in some of this process.
Thank you very much, David. Dr. Shamshad Loni has a question. Yes, please, Dr. Loni.
Good evening. This is Dr. Shamshad here. I have one question. What should be the duration between the completion of the work and the publication period? How many years or months?
I don't think there is no specific time, and I think there's a spectrum. For me, as soon as the work's done, I want to publish it. So there's an imperative. It's done. I want to write it up and I want to publish it. However, if you've got research that's been funded by, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry, you might not have the same amount of control over that. So they might want to wait, and that might add some time to it. But reading between the lines of your question, that, you know, if you've got some data that's 6 years old that you didn't write up and it's still relevant, then write it up. It's 6 years old. It's still data. It still has a point to make. Write it up anyway.
Okay, this is the answer. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay.
Welcome.
I think we can go for 2 more questions. Dr. Mashouk Dusty, please.
Good night. My question, can you hear me?
Yes, good evening. Yeah. It's good afternoon in London or in Leicester.
In Pakistan, it's night.
Fine.
Okay. My question is regarding the publication. Okay. For international or the impact factor journals, every journal has its own criteria, or there is international criteria for the paper to submit in the impact factors?
Not 100% sure I understand your question. Are you asking about journals in specifically, or are you asking? I'm not 100% sure I understand your question. Maybe you could try rephrasing it.
Yes, again, I'm rephrasing. Okay, I want to publish my paper in impact factor, I mean, international journal. Every journal has its own criteria, or there is any international criteria to submit my paper in any impact factor journal?
Right. So I think I understand your question. I think there would be no discrimination between any class of author wanting to submit any paper to any journal. And I think if that were the case, the journals would investigate it themselves. I think if you wanted to submit a paper to Nature, I'm probably guessing that you don't, but if you wanted to submit a paper to Nature, you should be perfectly entitled to submit a paper to Nature, the same as any other journal. If you're asking, are there any different criteria for international authors? The answer is no. Certainly for British Journal of Anaesthesia, and as the chairman of the board, I would be horrified if there were a different set of criteria for international authors compared to British or North European authors. I would be absolutely horrified, and that would stop straight away. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but if you've got, you say you want to publish your paper, so that means you've got a paper. You know, my advice as through the talk is get it written up well, get some help and advice with the construction, and if it's a good story, you can tell me where you got it published, because that's what will happen.
Thank you very much. And the last question, Dr. Farman Khan. Yes, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the great talk. So, Doctor, I have a question. I'm doing a review article in Dubai, and I have a colleague who I want to do the review article with in Australia. So in such a situation, what we want to do is we want to review, you know, on a particular topic, we want to do a sort of a meta-analysis. So in such a situation, and it will just be a review article. So in such cases, would I require ethical clearance from the local bodies as such?
I suppose it depends on the questions that you're asking. It depends on who you're asking them to. If it's just simple meta-analysis of pre-published literature, you won't need any approval at all. But if you're going to go back to people and ask them things, then you'll probably need approval from both centres. I think you said Australia and from wherever else you are. Pakistan, did you say?
UAE, Dubai.
So you need approval from both. Typically, the way it works is you would get approval in one and then have that approval then just submitted to the other, and it would effectively be endorsed. But if it's just a meta-analysis of pre-published literature, you wouldn't need any approval at all for that.
Thank you. So it would be this actually. We'll just be it will just be a simple meta-analysis of.
You wouldn't need approval for that anyway, because all of the papers that you would look at would state that they had approval anyway, and if they didn't, there would be something wrong, and if they didn't, they would fail your quality criteria from your meta-analysis anyway. So not necessary.
All right. Okay. That answers my question. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. There are two more questions, David. Are you fine to answer them now, or is that better for these colleagues to send you emails and ask you questions?
I'm still here. I prefer the direct, get to the point. So if they want to ask the question, then please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Dr. Badruddin Hamad, please ask your question, and just in 1 minute, please. Just two more questions. Dr. Badruddin Hamad, if you're ready. Okay, let's go to Dr. Abbas Sayed, please.
Yes, hello.
Yes, please ask your question.
Yes, thank you for this great talk from Professor. I have one question about the criteria for which scale can we measure the journal, like Scopus, Web of Science, which one better, and all of this, all these scales documented or recommended worldwide?
Okay. So I think there are two points there, that we're assuming that a simple number like an impact factor can give indication as to the quality of a journal. I think you have to read the impact factor with care, and it needs to be specialty relevant. So there's no point in comparing the British Journal of Anaesthesia with an impact factor of nearly 12 with the British Journal of Dermatology, for example, with a much smaller reach. But in terms of field relevance, then the British Journal of Dermatology is probably equal to the British Journal of Anaesthesia, comparing dermatology with anaesthesia. I think impact factor is is good and bad. It has good points and bad points, and there's a whole host of literature on that anyway. If you want to, the best place to look is in something called Clarivate, which is the organization that basically sets the impact factors. So I would look in Clarivate for the absolute best set of numbers. And another point that comes across now is thinking about that is you're all probably aware of predatory publishers. So I get 20 offers of publication every day from journals that I've never heard of. And if you've never heard of them and they've got a spurious impact factor, then just hit the delete button. They're not relevant. So the answer to your question is I would use Clarivate to check. And I would also pay particular attention to the difference between an impact factor and impact. So impact factor is important, but impact is probably just as important.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
I have
you.
one more, please. One more question about the.
Excuse me, Dr. Abbas Sayed, our time is finished. And if it's possible, please let Dr. Muhammad Asif to ask his questions as the final one. And if there are more questions, you can write directly to Professor Lambert. You can send him emails. And Dr. Asif,
Yeah,
Uh,
you want to ask your question? Yes,
Thank-
please.
Thank you, ma'am. I have a question about the registration of the clinical trials. How it deemed necessary, and what are the consequences if one can't register its clinical trial?
Okay, the likelihood is, I would say that the likelihood is very high, is that when you submit it to a journal, it will be rejected. That's the outcome. So you could probably do the study if it wasn't registered. You could probably do it, but you wouldn't get it published. And then you think, is it ethical to do a study that you won't get published? And there are so many sites in which you can register those trials. So really, there isn't any logical excuse. The Chinese often used to say there's a big problem that with blah blah blah, but a lot of the Chinese registration sites, they're now all up and running. So I think it's a kind of non-issue that you should just, if you're going to do it, you should get on and get it registered. And if you don't, then you'll get your paper rejected. But for sure, if you send it to BJA, it'll be rejected straight away.
But my observation, there are a few articles I have seen where there is no registration of these RTCs. And what is the value of that?
They will get less and less and less as time goes on. So for the youngsters who are listening today, by the time you're reaching mid-career, they will not exist anymore. They'll be dinosaurs. They'll not exist. I'm sure you'll get something published somewhere without a registration, but you know, the objective today is publishing in high-quality journals, and you know, you won't get it in a high-quality journal unless it's registered.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for your collaboration and wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us in this webinar. Have a nice time and see you again soon.
Again.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.